Around 2 decades ago, a little game called Test Drive Unlimited released. It took the Test Drive franchise in a bold new direction. Massive open world racing with some very heavy multiplayer elements. Which does sound a bit samey now, but if you remember, this was 2006, long before Forza Horizon came along. Now, if we count for spin-offs and localizations, this was the 19th Test Drive game in the franchise, which to me is just absolutely crazy. So here it is, Test Drive Unlimited, my original copy of the game that's moved up and down the country with me several times, and you know what, all things considered, it's in pretty good condition. So all the footage you'll be seeing today has been captured off of my Xbox 360, which is a sentence I don't really get to say very often, so let me start off this video by saying welcome to the Game Inspector. At least that's the series name that I'm currently going with. If you can think of something a bit better, then please let me know, because I'm not 100% set on it, but I kind of trialed this format a couple of months back with that deep dive I did on Driver San Francisco, and today, of course, we're focusing on Test Drive Unlimited. This series won't be exclusive to racing games, don't get me wrong, it just so happens that some of the biggest games that have had influence on me happen to be racing games, so that's what I'm talking about. But I'm sure there'll be future games we cover that are not. Anyway, enough yapping from me, let's jump into the history of Test Drive Unlimited. So before Test Drive Unlimited could reinvent the franchise, the Test Drive name had already been around for nearly 2 whole decades, and that's kind of important, because unlike some racing franchises, Test Drive didn't really have one clean set identity. Sometimes it was a street racer or an arcade racer, sometimes it was realistic, sometimes it wasn't, but it definitely wasn't always open world. Think of Test Drive as more of a badge, it's like a name that got attached to different racing fantasies across different eras. Exotic cars, police chases, illegal street races, off-road trucks, Le Mans prototypes, demolition derbies, you know, pretty much any kind of racing format you could slap the Test Drive badge on, and it was a Test Drive game. So by the time that Unlimited arrived in 2006, this was definitely a franchise with a big history, but also a franchise badly in need of a new direction. Anyway, the original Test Drive released all the way back in 1987 for the Amiga. Well, and other platforms, but originally for the Amiga. Its concept was simple but powerful, especially for the time. You put the player behind the wheel of cool cars and make it feel dangerous. You were driving these fast cars down public roads, dealing with traffic and police, and just trying to keep in control. And that early appeal was very clear. The game was essentially about cars you wanted to drive, but probably never would. With the original lineup of cars being a Lotus Esprit, a Porsche 911, a Corvette C4, and then a Ferrari and a Lamborghini, so very dreamlike cars. And in the late 80s, that was kind of enough. The technology was obviously primitive by today's standards, but the fantasy of driving these cars was very strong. Test Drive understood that racing games didn't have to be about lap times, it could just be about aspiring to drive cool cars. They could be about sitting inside something expensive, powerful, and just slightly out of reach. So that idea carried through the early entries in the series, especially the Duel, which is Test Drive 2. It expanded that formula with rival cars and some more content, but after the early 90s, the franchise started to lose momentum. Racing games were evolving very quickly, and 3D graphics were changing expectations of consumers, so Test Drive needed to modernise, so in the late 90s, the series came back again. And I would say this is where the road to Test Drive Unlimited really begins. So in 1997, a developer called Pitbull Syndicate got their hands on the franchise and launched Test Drive 4 on the original PlayStation and PC, and this was published by Accolade. This was the franchise trying to reassert itself in a new era of racing games. Faster, louder, and more aggressive than it had ever been before. And the game had a pretty clear sales pitch going for it again. Licensed supercars and muscle cars, point-to-point races, real-world locations, including the north of England for some reason, traffic, police, speed. It wasn't trying to be a careful sim, it was an arcade racer with a 90s attitude. I've actually done a full video on Test Drive 4 before, so if you want to hear my thoughts on that a bit more in depth, then go check it out after this video. Anyway, 1 year later we got Test Drive 5 from these same developers, and it was basically just the same thing, building momentum on top of 4. 90s arcade racing energy, licensed cars, real-world locations, police chases, driving that's very aggressive, and a soundtrack that belonged to its time. It was Test Drive trying to be cool. That's what it was, just plain cool. It was competing in an era where racing games were trying to be edgier and more stylish and more personality driven, which is one of the best eras of racing games anyway. The menus, the music, the car selection and overall presentation were all pushing toward a more modern, but kind of edgy identity. But even then, the series felt like it was chasing the market rather than actually leading it. Because by the late 90s, racing games, of course, were literally everywhere. Gran Turismo had raised expectations for car collecting and realism, arcade racers like Ridge Racer were becoming faster and flashier, street racing culture was on the brink of exploding into the mainstream, and Test Drive was just kind of chilling out in the middle of all that, recognizable but certainly not very dominant. Then in 1999 came Test Drive 6, and this is where the formula was definitely starting to feel a little bit stretched. Kinda like my Scooby-Doo stretch toy from when I was a kid that spilt all its goo everywhere because we ripped its arms off. Pretty dark comparison actually, but you get the idea. On paper, the game still had the right ingredients, the licensed cars, the police, the tournaments, the traffic, the city-based real-life tracks. It even included modes where you could drive as the police, chasing down racers and stopping threats, but the reaction was kind of mixed because the franchise had really settled into a pattern. All those things that I'd previously mentioned 3 times over. And it could still be fun, but it didn't feel very fresh. So the problem at this point wasn't that Test Drive didn't have an identity, it's the fact that it relied on that single identity way too much. So after Test Drive 6, the franchise kind of started to splinter. Instead of one clear path forward, the Test Drive name started appearing on very different kinds of racing games. There was Test Drive Le Mans, a much more focused endurance racing title, built around, of course, the famous 24-hour race, which obviously was nothing like the previous 3 Test Drive entries. Now, the interesting thing about Test Drive Le Mans is it's actually just a port of a previously released European racer called Le Mans 24 Hours. It's literally just localized and had the Test Drive name slapped on it. But in my books, that still makes it a Test Drive game. So we're now in 2002 and the series tried again with Test Drive Overdrive, The Brotherhood of Speed, which I believe was also just released as Test Drive in certain regions. This one is kind of important to me because it feels like the last real attempt to modernize that traditional Test Drive formula before Unlimited came along. It had the street racing, it had police, it had traffic and real-world locations like San Francisco, Tokyo, so on and so forth. But it also had a more cinematic early 2000s attitude and story, which obviously was the kind of tone that every racing game was reaching to be at that time. You can feel the franchise trying to evolve here. It wanted more personality and story and edge and spectacle, but it kind of, well, to put it bluntly, wasn't enough. Although I still enjoyed the game. Anyway, let's jump forward to 2004, because we have one more entry to look at before we actually focus on the game. So in 2004, Test Drive Eve of Destruction arrived, and this game could not have been further from that exotic car fantasy that the series began with. Instead of Ferraris or Lambos, it gave you battered, old junk cars. Instead of glamorous locations, it gave you dirt tracks and demolition arenas. And it was less stream garage and more local county fare after 3 cans of Monster, and weirdly, it worked. Eve of Destruction had a personality all of its own. It leaned into the chaos of that demolition derby culture, which is a very fun part of motorsport, giving players a rough, scrappy, deliberately unglamorous kind of racing game. This was a game that kind of threw out the window looking cool and pulled inside survival and smashing stuff and limping your car across the finish line. In some ways, it was probably one of the most distinct games to carry the Test Drive name, but that was also kind of the problem, because in 2004, what did Test Drive even mean anymore? Was it supercars, street racing, endurance motorsport, demolition derby? Well, the answer was yes. Yes, it's all of those things, and that makes it both interesting but incredibly confusing, because across the years before Unlimited you can see fragments of what the series wanted to be, but none of them ever really settled on one core thing. And so, after about, I don't know, 8 or 9 minutes of yapping, we now approach 2006, and we can finally talk about Test Drive Unlimited. So after years of Test Drive being pulled in different directions, Unlimited needed to do more than simply continue the series. It needed to completely change it, and that's exactly what Eden Games set out to do. Because the idea behind Test Drive Unlimited wasn't just make another racing game, no. It was much bigger than that concept. This was a game built around a fairly specific fantasy. What if you could move to Hawaii, buy a house, buy a car, and slowly build your way into the millionaire driving lifestyle that you've always dreamt of? Not just racing or collecting, and even on the box it says this, it's living. A racing lifestyle, if you will. That was the key difference between this and most other races at the time. All those other racing games were kind of structured around menus. You pick an event, select a car, race, earn money, upgrade, move on. You get the gist, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Some of the best racing games ever follow that structure, so don't take that as me complaining. But Test Drive Unlimited wanted to remove as much of that separation as possible. So instead of just dumping you on a menu and giving you a list of tracks, allow me to introduce the island of Oahu, or Oahu. I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced. I've tried to watch some videos understanding and I just can't quite nail it, so I'm really sorry if I've offended anyone with that pronunciation. Anyway, let's just say, welcome to Hawaii. Instead of presenting cars as simple unlocks, it puts those cars in dealerships. Instead of treating your garage like a menu screen, it tied it to actual houses you had to buy around the island, and you could see your cars in a garage or a garage. Wow, being able to look in your garage in a 2006 racing game is such a cool and innovative feature. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the future holds for these kinds of racing games. Okay, so what are the new features in Forza Horizon 6? Well, you can look in your garage at your cars. So yeah, obviously that sounds normal now, especially after years of open world racing games building on similar ideas, but back in 2006 this was incredibly, insanely ambitious. The concept was very simple to understand, but was also very large in scale. Take that original Test Drive fantasy that we spoke about earlier, driving fast cars on public roads, and expand it into a full open world experience. And the choice of location was crucial. Oahu wasn't just a random map, it gave the game variety, identity, and a really cool, beachy atmosphere. You had some dense city streets in Honolulu, long highways, really nice coastal routes, some cool mountain roads, tunnels, long bends, some more quiet residential areas, and stretches of road that felt like they existed purely for cruising down. And that variety really mattered, because Test Drive Unlimited wasn't so much about racing this time, it was kind of more about the drive you took between going to races, if that makes sense. It sounds like a small distinction, but it completely changes the feel of the game, because in a traditional racer, the world is mostly a container for events, but in Test Drive Unlimited, the world is part of the appeal, and in fact it's pretty much the main appeal of the game. Sometimes the most memorable moments from my playthrough weren't even in the actual races. It was just quiet moments of cruising around on these cool roads in a cool car that I just purchased. That sense of presence, of just simply existing in the world, is kind of what makes this game stand out. And a huge part of that came from its online concept. Now obviously, the official Xbox 360 version servers have been shut down for about 14 years. But the PC version does have a modding community that has the multiplayer living on. But anyway, Atari marketed the game around the idea of massively open online racing, or MORE for short, which is a very mid-2000s acronym, and it's actually plastered on the back of the box, but the idea behind it was actually quite forward-thinking. The goal wasn't just to have separate online races sitting in their own menu, it was to blend online players into the same open world you were already exploring. And if you are playing this on an Xbox 360 in 2026, you can still see some ideas from this splinter into the game, because you can and will encounter NPC drivers in the world instead of actual players. Basically, it has an offline mode where you can still see all these drivers and interact in the same way, it just lacks any humanity because they're not actually real. But anyway, yeah, the idea was you could be cruising alone, minding your own merry business, and then suddenly see another real player on the road. No lobby, no loading into a separate track, just someone else driving through the same island. It's probably what living on the Isle of Wight feels like. Anyway, from there you could challenge them to a race or whatever, and that one idea gave the game a completely different energy. Because even when you weren't actively racing online, the possibility of interaction was always there. The world didn't feel entirely yours, it was shared. Other players became part of the scenery and atmosphere and the fantasy. And again, today that doesn't sound particularly revolutionary, but in 2006, on Xbox 360, that was a big ass deal. This was before open world races had fully settled into what they would become, before the genre had a clear template for shared world driving. And that was before online connectivity was just assumed as part of the package. Test Drive Unlimited was trying to build a game that felt persistent, not massively multiplayer in the same way as an MMO, but inspired by that same sense of a living online space. And that's why the lifestyle elements mattered so much more. The houses weren't just cosmetic, they actually represented your progression. Buying a new property meant having more space for cars, which meant owning more cars, which meant expanding your collection. And what's cool is that instead of just displaying all your cars on a menu or on a list, your cars were in different physical places on the island amongst your properties, and dealerships worked the same way. You don't just buy cars from a menu in this game, you actually have to drive to the corresponding dealership of the brand's cars that you want to purchase. You walk into the showroom, you look at the car, choose the rims, the colour, and you bought it. That extra layer of ritual made ownership feel more meaningful and created a bigger connection between you and the car, that I would argue has kind of been lost in games like Forza Horizon, because you can literally win up to 3 cars at once on a super wheel spin, and there's just nothing personal about it because 90% of them will never ever actually get used. And Test Drive Unlimited is just full of those small rituals. Buying clothes, visiting tuning shops, taking on delivery missions, driving models or hitchhikers across the island, returning cars without damaging them. These activities weren't always perfect, don't get me wrong, and some were definitely more interesting in concept than execution, but they helped sell the idea that this was a world that existed way beyond just generic racing events. And that's where Eden Games' vision becomes very clear. This is 100% a driving lifestyle game through and through. It's aspirational but relaxed, and something that understood that for car enthusiasts, the fantasy doesn't necessarily have to begin at the starting line, it begins before that, when you choose the car and leave the garage and hear the engine start and just drive around with no objective. That honestly could be Test Drive Unlimited's biggest contribution to the entire genre. It treated cruising as gameplay, not filler or downtime, or, it didn't have Anna drive the car for you. It was actual gameplay, and I guess that was quite risky. Because from a design perspective, building a huge open world racing game around atmosphere and freedom is quite difficult. You need enough structure to keep players engaged, but enough openness to let them make their own fun as well. You need a big world that's enough to feel impressive, but readable enough that players don't feel lost or overwhelmed. And then of course you need online systems that feel seamless but stable enough not to break the illusion. And yeah, the game didn't get all of that perfectly right, no of course it didn't, it was never going to. And there are rough edges everywhere, the physics can feel strange, the presentation can be a bit awkward, and the character models, oh god, the character models have that early plastic mannequin energy, and some of the lifestyle systems are fairly shallow once you really break them down, but the concept, guys, the concept is incredibly strong, and strong enough that even years later, people like me still talk about Test Drive Unlimited less like a racing game and more like a place that I remember visiting and growing up in, and that's kind of rare. Most racing games are remembered for their cars, their tracks, their handling, and Test Drive is kind of remembered for its island. for the feeling of driving across it, for the dream of owning a house in Hawaii with a garage of supercars and nowhere in particular to be. And that's what makes its development so interesting, because Eden Games kind of modernized Test Drive, yeah, but they also found the fantasy that had been buried inside the series since the beginning and finally built a world big enough and interesting enough to contain it. Alright, so I've given all the talk about this being an open world driving lifestyle game, but the game obviously still needs structure. I mean, it couldn't just give you an island, some cars, and say, well, have fun. I mean, it could, and honestly, I think a lot of players probably would have been happy with that, but for the sake of argument to keep the game moving, Test Drive Unlimited built its progression around a wide range of events scattered across Oahu. These were the activities that gave purpose to the map, the reasons to leave your house, pick a car, and drive across the island. There's such a strange mix of events in this game, and I think it kind of reflects the game's identity pretty well. Some are fairly traditional, some are experimental, some are kind of charming, and some are really irritating. But together, they do help sell that fantasy that Test Drive Unlimited isn't just a racing game, it's a driving game. You know, there's a difference there. So let's just go through what's on offer. So obviously you've got the standard race, and they are exactly what you'd expect. Line up against other drivers, follow the route, hit checkpoints, and try to finish first. It's nothing revolutionary, but at least it's still on the open world structure. It's not closed circuit racing, you're just on the Hawaiian roads. I will just say right now that especially in the earlier difficulties, but even as you head up towards Expert and beyond, some of the NPC drivers are incredibly stupid. They come off the road a lot, they crash a lot, so for the most part until you're in the very, very late game, the races can be very easy and it is kind of boring at times. But to keep things a bit interesting and avoiding the fact that the NPCs are morons, there are other challenges in these races. Sometimes traffic is present, so you'll be dodging that. Sometimes there'll be a bar on the top left that shows how well you're driving, and the more you come off the track, the more you get penalised at the end, so even if you come first, if you've driven really badly, you might actually not be first. So I think that adds some excitement and interesting parts to those races. So then you have the time trials, and obviously these strip away the direct competition and turn the focus just on you. So there's no opponents anymore, and in case of that, no excuses to be bad. Just you, the car, the route, and the clock. Again, some of these time trials have traffic, some don't. Some have the additional drive well challenge, otherwise you lose time, stuff like that. It does spice things up every now and then, and to be honest, with the driving model in this game, it is a lot of fun to do time trials. In some ways, the time trials kind of show the driving model at its most exposed, because without other racers to distract you, every mistake you make is very obviously your fault. And depending on the car, that can either feel satisfying if you brake too late but you've done it, or it can feel absolutely brutal. Because the handling model in this game is probably one of the weirdest that I've played in this kind of style of racing game. I struggled to sum up words to describe it to you guys, but I guess it kind of sits in a strange place between arcade and simulation. It really wants you to feel the weight and power of the cars, but it's definitely not always smooth, and it's definitely not always forgiving. Some vehicles feel more planted and enjoyable, and others feel like they're constantly one mistake away from launching themselves in a hedge, which I guess is kind of just like choosing a car in real life, especially when it comes to supercars. I can't say that I've driven many in my time, but I can imagine that is what it's like. So it means that time trials can become less about pure speed and more about kind of almost holding back and being disciplined. So another event type they have are speed events. So instead of just reaching the finish line or beating a time, these events ask you to maintain high speeds through specific sections of road. It's like just doing the speed cameras on Forza Horizon, but as an overall event. So there'll be 4 or 5 different speed cameras placed in an area, and it's up to you to decide the best route and the way to approach it. Now, these events are quite fun, don't get me wrong, sometimes they're actually incredibly challenging, but my one big thing with this is that when you go past the speed camera, the flash is so disorienting. It's so strong and bright and lasts a lot longer than you'd expect it to. I will just say here, there's a big warning for epilepsy because there will just be a flash on the screen showing this. So if that's a problem, just jump ahead to the time on screen now. So now, those are the main kind of actual structured racing event types, but there are other events in this game as well, and that's where it kind of gets interesting. Sometimes the game asks you to be a chauffeur, it can ask you to be a courier, it can ask you to deliver a car without scratching it, and these missions are kind of crucial to the game's identity. Take the hitchhiker missions. On paper, they're simple. Pick someone up and drive them to their destination. Usually they want you to get there quickly, but they also don't want you driving like a complete psychopath. Which is awkward because this is a racing game, really. So suddenly the challenge isn't just go fast, it's go fast without scaring the shit out of your passenger too much, and that kind of changes how you approach the driving. You're still pushing for time, yeah, but now you're also having to worry about smoothness, so avoiding any impacts, curbs, reckless driving, and it will lower your score or even fail the mission. And then there are the model delivery missions, and this is definitely very much so a product of the mid-2000s. You drive a model to a location and are rewarded with clothing coupons or access to new outfit options. That whole fashionable lifestyle angle can feel a bit awkward now, and the presentation definitely has that glossy, slightly artificial early days of HD vibe, but mechanically these missions reinforce the idea that your character exists in this world beyond the car. So instead of just collecting vehicles or whatever, you know, your character's building an image for themselves, not just the cars, which is the whole selling point of the game. Lifestyle, which I've said 100 times, but that is the point. You know, is it particularly deep? No, not really, but it does add some flavour, and sometimes that flavour is all we need. So yeah, of course, not all of these event types are equally as enjoyable or equally as successful. Some races can feel repetitive. In fact, sometimes you might actually need to repeat races to grind for money. Some time limits can be quite harsh, but it does add to the challenge. Some missions stretch on, I would argue, maybe a little bit too long, and because the island is so large, failed attempts can feel especially painful when you spent several minutes driving only to make one mistake near the end and have to start again and lose another 10 minutes. But that's the trade-off with Test Drive Unlimited's design. Its scale gives events weight, but that weight can also make failure much more frustrating. A short race in a closed circuit game, you know, that's easy to restart. But a long island-spanning event in Test Drive Unlimited feels more like a journey, and there is an event that sees you driving around the entire island. You know, that's like 100 miles or something. And, you know, if you fail near the end, it's frustrating, but it means that the success is much more satisfying. But yeah, the rough edges are definitely there. As I say, AI drivers can be very inconsistent. The traffic sometimes feels unfairly placed. The physics don't always behave exactly how you'd expect, and some events seem tuned around patience rather than tuned around having fun. But even when the events aren't perfect, they almost always serve the bigger fantasy, giving you reasons to explore the island and make different types of driving feel meaningful. Now, one part of this game that does, I'm going to be so real, actually really annoy me is the police presence. I completely get that police have to be there, especially when we're talking about a game where the whole point is having all these supercars and driving quite fast. But oh my goodness, why are they so overreactive to everything? If you're driving about in the free roam, open world segments between races and you clip, scrape, stare at another car that is an NPC, and that's it. The police are on you. And at first it's kind of like a warning, and if you don't do it again after like 10 seconds, then you're clear. But let's say that you go over a hill too fast, you take off, you bounce into one car and straight into another. The minute you hit a second vehicle, the police will be on you for what feels like a lifetime. You can either run away and hide and try and wait for the cooldown, which can genuinely take minutes, or you can sometimes pay quite a large amount of money, depending on how wanted you actually are, to enter your house, an event, or whatever, just to pay them off so that they're not on you anymore. I don't know, man. I get the point of the police being in the game, and I understand they have to be there, but I'm sure there are ways to make them slightly less trigger-happy than what they are in this game. Because when they're on you, they're not even that much of a problem, but the thing is, if they ram into you, you get extra wanted level because it thinks you've crashed into them when they've crashed into you. I don't know, the whole setup of it just isn't very well designed in my opinion. I'm probably in the minority here. I'm sure a lot of you probably think it's fine. So, you know, tell me if I'm wrong, but to me, it just seemed quite annoying. Alright, so let's talk about the presentation in this game, because obviously this is a game that's trying to sell that whole vibe of being on Hawaii, so in my opinion, the visuals kind of matter a bit more than some other racing games, because that whole presentation is part of that fantasy. So visually, Test Drive Unlimited is very much so a game of its time. It's early Xbox 360 era, early HD, that strange period where games were suddenly much sharper, much bigger, and much more ambitious, but also still figuring out how to actually use all that new technology. And you can feel that immediately. Now don't get me wrong, the visuals probably don't look as good in this video as they did as I was recording them, because this capture card is quite old, I need a new one, and I already know that it's going to look a bit more toned down than it actually does on my screen, but the idea is still there. There's a certain crispness to Test Drive Unlimited that would have felt impressive back in 2006. You know, the roads stretch far into the distance, the cars have some really good reflective paintwork, the lighting is brighter and cleaner than what players were used to on the previous gen, and the island feels big in a way that racing games rarely did at the time, but it's also not a game that holds up kind of on raw detail. If you look close enough, obviously the age is going to show. The character models are stiff, animations are really awkward, shops and houses have that slightly sterile early HD showroom look, and I wouldn't even suggest looking at some of the mountain textures as you're driving past them, they look very rough. The world can sometimes feel sparse with large areas that don't really have much going on beyond roads and trees, but here's the thing, most of the time you're not really looking that closely at stuff, you're just driving around, and when you're driving, the game can still look fantastic in the way that matters the most. I mean, not technically, but atmospherically. Like I've said before, the island is the star of the presentation. Oahu gives the game an identity that no generic city map could have matched. And that's where the game's visual design works best, not in individual textures or certainly not in character faces, but in the feeling of space. And not only a feeling of space, but a sense of escape. The map stretching out in every direction, the feeling that you could turn left, right, or just keep going. You know, it sounds incredibly simple, but I think, to me, that's what makes the game so memorable. A lot of racing games are visually impressive because they are dense, but this is more visually memorable because it feels so open, and that's a very big difference. And the car presentation is just as important. This is a game obsessed with the idea of desirable cars, not just fast ones, but desirable ones. Cars you browse and test and save up for. Cars that you visit in dealerships before you can actually afford them. That was like me with my Suzuki Swift. Anyway, that showroom experience does a lot of work. Walking into a dealership, rotating the camera around a car, you know, choosing the colour. These are small interactions, but they make the cars feel like objects of aspiration rather than just simple stat blocks. And once you're on the road, the camera options add to that fantasy. The cockpit view in particular is, like, actually insane. Like, it's still really good and holds up 20 years later. It really helps sell the luxury and personality of each vehicle. So many racing games, even now, don't do the cockpit all that well. Like, it's fine, don't get me wrong, but I don't think there's been many games that have done it as well as Test Drive Unlimited has. And I would say that that same kind of vibe applies to the way that the cars move through the world. The animation of suspension, the way vehicles lean under braking or acceleration, the way high-speed driving feels just ever so slightly unstable. It all contributes to the sense that these machines have weight and presence. You know, is it perfect? No, not at all. The handling can definitely be strange, and visually the physics can sometimes look just a tad bit awkward, and crashes are definitely stiff. But, you know, it's got that slightly rubbery chaos you get in a lot of mid-2000s driving games, and even then, those rough edges still become part of the character. Alright, so what about the audio? Because this is where Test Drive Unlimited becomes a little bit more complicated. The sound design basically has two very different jobs. It needs to sell the cars, and it needs to sell the lifestyle. The car audio is definitely the more important of the two, and for the most part it does the job. Engines have enough character that cars don't all feel identical, a supercar obviously doesn't sound like a muscle car or a hatchback. Everything has its own distinct personality. Higher end cars feel sharper and more exotic. Again, this isn't going to be modern sim racing audio, so you're not getting obsessive mechanical detail, but you are getting enough personality for the fantasy to work, and in a game where you spend so much time cruising about, that definitely matters. Because when you're driving long distances, the engine sounds become part of the atmosphere, especially if you just turn the radio off because you've heard all the songs 100 times. Now, speaking of that radio, I would say the soundtrack is a bit more divisive. It has radio stations, licensed tracks, and a clear attempt to give the island a musical identity, and when it works, it does help. Cruising down a coastal road with the right song playing can make the game just feel cool. The music gives long drives a sense of rhythm, and it turns ordinary journeys into these little road movie moments. But the soundtrack is obviously not universally iconic. This is most certainly not one of those racing games where every single song becomes permanently burned into the memory of an entire generation, Burnout or Need for Speed. Some songs fit the vibe perfectly, but others just fade into the background. And depending on your taste, you might find yourself switching stations or turning the music down entirely, or, just playing your own music through Spotify or Apple Music or something. But even then, the idea behind the soundtrack does make sense. The radio isn't there to pump adrenaline into races, it's there because you're driving around an island, and, what do you do when you're driving? You put the radio on. Which, yeah, sounds obvious, but it's another example of the game understanding the fantasy at a lifestyle level. And that's really the key to the game's presentation overall. A lot of Test Drive Unlimited looks and sounds dated now, there's no getting around that, it's 20 years old for God's sake. The world can be empty, the people look unnatural, and the menus have a very specific mid-2000s gloss. But atmosphere is not the same thing as fidelity, and the game definitely has atmosphere. It has a mood, a very cool, specific mood, and that's why the game still sticks with people. That's why this game is still good. Now, I would feel quite bad if I didn't mention the fact that this game also has a port on PlayStation 2 and PSP. Obviously, it doesn't have as many cars or the same visuals as the 360 version because it never could, but in a way I'd argue it's probably more impressive than the actual home console version of Test Drive Unlimited, because this still had an open world map, it still had like 100 cars, it was quite literally Test Drive Unlimited on the go, just with some visual downgrades. And even the physics were still alright. I'm not going to go into major detail about it today, as I probably will cover this in a future video for the game, but seeing as this is a dedicated Test Drive Unlimited video, it would be kind of rude to not mention it. Anyway, so in terms of critical response, this game reviewed pretty darn well for the Xbox 360. On Metacritic, it currently holds an 82 out of 100 based on 69 critic reviews, and the user score is 8.3 out of 10, which is still pretty damn good going. But just so you understand how well that they got the PSP and PlayStation 2 ports right, the PSP version holds an 80 out of 100 and the PlayStation 2 a 75, so still both very strong scoring games. Now, in terms of sales figures for the 360 version specifically, I wasn't able to find a exact number, but across all 4 different versions, so 360, PC, PS2 and PSP, it was estimated to have sold just over 2 million copies, and with the bulk of that probably coming from the Xbox 360 version, as that's what it was heavily marketed to be on. So let's answer the question, is Test Drive Unlimited really that good? And you know what? Yes, it is. I think if you approach this game, if you've never played it before, with the idea of the fact that it is a product of 2006, and you go in with those cool sunglasses on, it's fantastic. It's a lot of fun. The physics can be occasionally wonky. The NPC drivers, they aren't the smartest people ever. But overall, the vibes of this game are just immaculate. It's so much fun. And whilst I have not yet played Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown, which I believe tried to capture some of this, I think that this game does it so much better. The only thing for me that's a shame now is that I couldn't 100% the achievements on the Xbox 360 version because the multiplayer servers have shut down. Always annoys me when games have multiplayer achievements locked on them, really frustrates me. But anyway, This is a great game, it obviously reviewed well, it sold well, so yes, it is really that good, and if you have not played Test Drive Unlimited, go and play it. Go and play it. I mean, even play the other versions, but this is the version I'm familiar with, it goes unbelievably hard, and you can pick it up for quite cheap. So that brings us to the end of our look at Test Drive Unlimited, and this episode of what I'm deciding to call the Game Inspector. As I mentioned at the start, if you have a better name for the series, you know, I'm all ears, but for now, thank you very much for watching. Share all your thoughts in the comments down below about this game, and if you have any games you want me to look at more in depth, then let me know. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thank you and goodbye.